Hi kittens, and welcome back to Cat Talks. My name is Kat, this is a place where I talk, and today I'm going to be talking about all of the different flavours of fantasy. So this is my new series. It is called Getting Genre With It. Getting genre with it. And today we are talking about fantasy. So a lot of people feel that labelling a book with genre at all, and particularly with a subgenre, is a way, kind of like a marketing ploy, and it isn't really helpful for readers or for writers. But I don't agree. Having researched into it and being a very vivacious reader myself, I really enjoy the idea of subgenres for helping me find the next book. You know, you finish a book, you really enjoyed it, you want more in a similar vein. You can use subgenres to find things like that. It's also a good way of talking about what you enjoy or don't enjoy in a particular genre. Genre itself usually defines what kinds of books a person enjoys and reads. For example, you see a lot of "I like fantasy" in booktube newbie tags, for example, or "I like sci-fi" or "I like contemporary." And these genres we kind of hold as a big standard. But what about subgenres? Do you read only particular subgenres of fantasy? So before we start talking about the particular subgenres of fantasy, I do want to address the high versus low fantasy. Now, I haven't seen this as much in later years, but it is still something that people use to categorise books. So, what does it mean? Well, it's not a kind of comment on the quality of the book. High fantasy refers to things where the world is completely separate from our own, or our own is kind of redundant to the world. It's not really necessary for this world to exist. And you see this in things like Game of Thrones, for example, or in the Discworld series. Our world exists as a parallel universe in the Discworld series, but we don't influence it at all. In low fantasy, however, you have intrusions of fantasy on our world. So, for example, Harry Potter, there is a magical world, but it kind of has to live within the realm of the Muggles. And Twilight as well. There is the normal world that everyone knows about, and then a hidden vampire world inside it. So Nikki Gamble also has a third category. She has worlds which our world doesn't exist in, we have worlds which is our world, and then the third category is portal categories, where our world is used as a springboard to get to a fantasy world, maybe as two sides of the same coin, and usually through a portal. That being said, there are many different types of fantasy that don't even need to consider whether they're high or low fantasy. Now, obviously, contemporary tends to be low fantasy because it is set in our world and our time. Alright, so let's talk about fantasies that don't have anything to do with which world they're set in, and that would be comic. Comic fantasies are usually tongue-in-cheek takes on the world. So favourites in this genre include Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens, which is obviously a kind of like satirical take on the film The Omen. We also have all of Terry Pratchett's work, to be honest. Like, that is all very comedically gold. And I would also add here Rick Cook's works. He does a fantasy series where a programmer is accidentally summoned to save a magical realm and has to work out how to use magic without any magical skills. Grimdark and dark fantasy are terms that you've probably heard if you've been on booktube for more than a week. Dark fantasy is usually a kind of twist of horror and fantasy mixed together. They are different from horror in the sense that they don't necessarily want to instill fear in the audience. They are usually from the creature's perspective, or from someone who is close to the creature's perspective, and so you get a lot of sympathy for the horror in this case. Examples include The Master and Margarita, they include Anne Rice's work, they include Stephen King's The Dark Tower. These are all books that really kind of just focus on the nitty-gritty darkness that is inside us all. And they are often underscored by a very morally grey protagonist. On the other hand, grimdark is a world set in a very dystopian, very dark, very kind of like, there's violence, there's anger, there's torture. It's a very dystopian, very hard-hitting world. And in this case we have things like George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, where there isn't necessarily magic, there is some, but not much. There is a lot of grimdark aspects, however there is a lot of violence, particularly against women, and sexual violence, and there is a lot of, obviously, just plain dystopia. And I would also add N.K. Jesmond's The Fifth Season to this, because that is also a very dystopian society. The world is protected from earthquakes by a very feared magicians, and someone's children have been taken from them, so it's very grimdark. So grimdark is sort of a mixture of dystopia and violence and anger and kind of like mixed into a big ball with fantasy. But that is why dark fantasy and grimdark are different things. So you will have heard of epic or high fantasy, most probably. These are usually used interchangeably to mean a fantasy, usually quite a long fantasy, sort of Lord of the Rings length, where a hero who is immature, goes on a journey, becomes a mature person, makes friends, saves the world. That is a very big part of the genre, is saving the world or saving the universe or defeating the nameless evil, the evil one, the dark lord. This fantasy genre, subgenre, usually focuses on a nameless evil or an unknowable evil that you have to fight against. This is a kind of in contrast with grimdark, because the hero usually is a good person and is fighting against an evil coming into their society rather than their society itself being evil. Obviously, J.R.R. Tolkien is a good example here, but so is The Wheel of Time. These are epically long fantasies. They deal with a lot of nuance and a lot of depth, and usually quite hard to write. I would also add here Hafsa Zyfal's We Hunt the Flame and Nnendi Okofor's Who Fears Death. These are both epic fantasies set in a non-European culture, and they show the protagonist going on a journey, finding themselves and taking down evil. Kind of related to that, we have heroic fantasy. This is often with a person being born to nothing and being born as a commoner, kind of gaining their power, gaining their magic, and going on a quest to save their village or their town and becoming a much stronger person through that. Very much in contrast to grimdark, in heroic fantasies usually everyone is beautiful and strong and the problems are easy to solve, and it's just, you know, it's a good time. The hero becomes a hero, the end. Heroic fantasy is also known as swords and sorcery genre because it's, you know, all about swords and sorcery and a focus on personal battles rather than on saving the world. Really good examples of this genre include Graceling. This is the story of a young woman who was born with powers that she did not know about necessarily. I haven't read it, clearly, but this is about a young woman with powers trying to survive in the world. Then we come to contemporary fantasy. This is probably the more mainstream subgenre of fantasy. It is huge. It contains anything that was set in the modern world at the time of writing. So again, things like Harry Potter, things like Twilight, Redemption in Indigo by Karen Lord. I would also include Anne Rice here, Kelly Armstrong. All of the urban fantasies are subgenres of the contemporary fantasy genre. And this, as I said, is fantasy set in our current day world, but usually with hidden or intrusive aspects that like a normal person would never see in that world until they are exposed to it through some reason. The contemporary fantasy genre is quite fun because you can obviously play with technology versus magic and things like that, and it's not necessarily juxtaposition. In contrast to contemporary, we have two subgenres. We have historical fantasy and we have gaslamp fantasy. Historical fantasy is usually set in the Middle Ages. It is a very dark and gritty place with no technology at all, and people are trying to survive through using magic. It is often, but not always, set in Europe or with a very European culture. Think again Game of Thrones, think again The Wheel of Time, that kind of vibe to it, but set in our world. And I would also add to this The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. Again, this is a very kind of like medieval or before technology feel to it, before like society's shift towards technology, I guess you would say. And on the other hand, we have gaslamp fantasies. This is more of a steampunk-esque, but without the technology again. This is usually a Victorian or Edwardian setting. Here I would put things like Deanna Wynne Jones's The Chrestomanci series, which was incredible, by the way, and also The Paper Magician by Charlie H. Holmberry. They're both set in very rigid societies, and magic is a very big part of those societies, but they are also quite Elizabethan or Victorian. You know, there's dresses and there's manners. Speaking of manners, we have the fantasy of manners. This is also known as political fantasy, or contains aspects of political intrigue. This genre is probably one of my favourites. It is usually about fighting with words and with wit and with knowledge rather than fighting with swords and sorcery. And it is set in very much within a rigid society, so within a class system or within a caste system. Your enemies are your neighbours, not the government, not some unnamed evil, but just the stupidity or recklessness or just your neighbours in general. It's very much a more confined fantasy in terms of what you can do with it, in terms of who you interact with, but I love it. Obviously, inspiration for this genre is a lot of Jane Austen. It's a lot of the Gothics of that time. So we've got the Bronte sisters there, you know, that kind of feeling to it, but with fantasy elements. Often the fantasy elements are downplayed in this genre, but it's just fun. Some examples in particular of fantasy of manners: Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This is a tome of a book, but is set in a world where magicians are sort of on the downfall during the Victorian era and really focuses on that, and it's fun. And then we have Gormenghast by Mervyn Price, which is considered one of the first installments in this genre. That's actually a contemporary for the first 3 books. This is more of a historical fiction at first, but then the Gothic theme, sort of like the Gothic feeling of the book is what gives it a fantasy feel, and as the series progresses it does get more and more fantastical. So you might have heard of hard fantasy and wonder where that fits in with the subgenres. Now hard fantasy is just a tag or a description of a fantasy world where the magic follows rules and you can understand it. It is a very defined and knowable world. So this is things like the magic system works in a very specific way, like there are elements to the magic that build up and you know how they work. There are no real twists in terms of how the world works. A lot of people put George R.R. Martin's creations here because there is so little magic that the politics, and in particular the reactions to those politics and the consequences of your actions, are so well defined and you really do suffer from them. A lot of people put Brandon Sanderson, tag all of Brandon Sanderson's works with the hard fantasy tag because he is such a master of creating magical systems which make sense, kind of like Lego blocks, and you know how they all fit together. Paranormal romance is another one of the fantasy subgenres that kind of stands alone. It is often either a portal fantasy or a contemporary fantasy. It's often got a human person from our world falling in love with someone who is not of our world, whether it's a vampire, a werewolf, a demon, a god. It's often a female protagonist of the humans, but it is not always that case, and this is a really fun genre. I really enjoy it. It can be a lot of fun. Again, we have Kelly Armstrong here, who does a series of non-human females or human magical females falling in love. They're all very empowering books. I really enjoy that series. I think it's called The Underworld, or The Women of the Underworld. It often blends, not always, but often blends other genres such as the mystery genre or as I said, the portal genre. We've got PC Cast's Divine by Mistake, where a woman, is portaled into another world where she has to marry a centaur because her twin was marrying a centaur. Pretty much all of PC Cast's books could be counted as paranormal romances. And then as a subgenre, again, of paranormal romance, we have paranormal erotica, things like the Mary Gentry series and the Anita Blake series by Laurel K. Hamilton. These are books that have fantasy elements, have vampires or werewolves or fae, but are also mainly focused on the erotic side of writing fiction. So now you might think that something called romantic fantasy would fit under this genre of paranormal romance, but this romantic fantasy is actually more about chivalry. It's more about going on an adventure, making a found family of friends, fulfilling a quest and becoming a human or an adult or a mature person through that quest. So it's very much focused on things like Don Quixote, that kind of genre where it's very much focused on being a good person in that chivalrous rulebook sense. So what is magical realism? It's sort of contemporary fantasy, but it also isn't. So it is set in the real world, but normally in magical realism there is one element of magic that everyone knows about and everyone accepts. So it might be that the first time you lock eyes with someone, if they're the one, you feel this strong pull towards them. It could be that the first words someone says, your soulmate says, are written on your flesh. It could be that you can correctly predict when someone in your family is going to die. They are elements of magic, one element in particular of fantasy that is sort of taken as granted in this world. Really good examples of magical realism include things like Haruki Murakami's entire body of work is usually very magical realism-esque. It's usually unknowable and undefined magic intruding into our world as well. That can also be magical realism. And the final kind of genres that I'm going to touch on before I go into more origin-specific genres are liminal fantasies, and these are fantasies where it sort of might be fantasy and it also might be contemporary. It's very confusing. It tends to want to inspire awe or horror or fear into the reader, probably a combination of all three. And the same with weird fiction. Actually, weird fantasy or weird fiction was the title for all fantasy, science fiction, horror, all of those genres before we actually had words for them. And nowadays the new weird focuses on blending those genres and kind of like bringing about new things to look at and think about. So in this case, think of Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, and also China Mieville's entire body of work, but particularly Perdido Street Station. These are fantasies that really make you think, and they're not necessarily just fantasies. And the other one that I'm just going to touch on briefly is portal fantasy. This is a genre of fantasy where someone from our world is sucked into another world. And this is a famous example, for we have things like The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, we have things like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It's a very classic tale, it's also very modern. We have Bridget Kemmerer's A Curse So Dark and Lonely is a good example of a portal fantasy, so yes. Alright, now so going into fantasies that have their genres kind of based more on the culture that they come from, we're going to start with fantastique. Now this is a French literary tradition that grew up alongside the English and American fantasy genres, but this is also quite different. It can be thought of as a midpoint between contemporary and portal fantasies and between magical realism as well, because the magical intrusions are often not understood by the protagonist or the people around him, and the protagonist often tries to explain them away. Because of this, because of the confusion of the protagonist and the things that are happening, the reader often experiences fear when reading a fantastique. Think of things like the Phantom of the Opera or Intermezzo. These are very Intermezzo is about a ghost in a small town who just changes the politics of it forever. And the Phantom of the Opera, you probably know, it's about a composer who takes over an opera and seduces a woman and carries her away and all sorts of things. So this genre is very hard to pin down. It's a very French literary tradition and it's kind of cool. Then I'm going to add Dungeons and Dragons into this. That obviously Dungeons and Dragons is a subgenre of gaming. It is a role-playing game where you roll dice, you have a character sheet, you roll dice, and as a group you collectively tell a story. Now authors have been writing novels in the Dungeons and Dragons universe using the same method. So they will have character sheets for each of their characters, they will write the book, and when something happens they will roll the dice, and whatever the dice say is what happens. So you might be thinking, Kat, your hair's changed, you have so many more braids now. The braids, they're multiplying! My camera decided not to record the last like 10 minutes of me talking. I noticed that it had stopped recording and recorded the outro, but in the middle it just deleted about 5 to 10 minutes of me, so yay! I was talking about culturally specific fantasies and I just wanted to touch on a couple more. So the first is Magical Girl. This started in Japan and it is still mainly in Japan, although there are some Western versions of this, and this is girls with magical powers, usually in a non-magical world. So you know, you just have a girl, she magic. Then you have two from China. You have wuxia. This is the Chinese martial art. It's usually a poor man growing up, becoming very strong and very powerful in the martial arts community, and then defending the weak and doing kind of justice stuff. So it's very similar to the romantic fantasy that we already talked about, in that it is protecting the poor and kind of like giving your life over. A big part of wuxia is that it is not, that the main hero is not kind of like beholden to an overlord in any way. He doesn't owe allegiance to anyone except for justice. And then finally we have Gods and Demons, which is a slightly older fantasy version of wuxia. It's kind of like an epic fantasy set in China. It usually contains Chinese gods, Chinese demons, Chinese ghosts. It's very cool. Journey to the West and the comedic version of Journey into the West are good examples of this. Unfortunately, during the Chinese Revolution, the Chinese government determined that wuxia and Gods and Demons and pretty much any fantasy was actually, you know, bad, and so they destroyed a lot of it, but luckily a couple of newer authors have been taking up the Gods and Demons and wuxia genres and really bringing them back to life. Alright, I'm going to pass the baton back to Old Cat from yesterday, whose footage was deleted, as she talks to you about fables and fairy tales. Finally, we have fables and fairy tales. Fables are usually using anthropomorphic animals and things like that, and usually have a tale. So you will have heard, for example, the story of the hare and the tortoise. They have the hare and the tortoise telling stories, racing, and the tortoise wins because he doesn't use up all his energy at the beginning of the race. Spoilers! That is a good example of a fable. And on the other hand, we have fairy tales. Now this isn't just anything to do with the fae. This is a literary tradition. It is usually an exploration of human character through these fantasy elements. We have things in here like Hansel and Gretel. They are short stories, they are usually quite dark and violent, and they are set in a particular time period. Nowadays, of course, we have a lot of retellings that retell fairy tales and explore further the social positions of the people involved. We also have retellings that bring the girl into question, so she isn't just a helpless damsel, but she is the one doing the rescuing. And good examples of this include Ella Enchanted, for example, where the Cinderella of the day isn't trying to escape just because she's poor and doesn't want the prince to know, but because she has a condition which means that she must obey any order given to her, and evil people know of this. So yes, that is, I think, every subgenre of fantasy, at least that I know of. If I've missed any, please drop comments down below explaining what they're called and what they are, so that everyone can use this as a learning resource. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you've learned something new today. I've talked for about half an hour and my mouth is so dry, so I'm gonna go and grab a drink. I hope you have a tasty cup of tea and a brilliant book to fall into. Check out this video if you haven't already, subscribe down below, and I will see you next time.